Thank you for tuning in to the Practical Preservation Podcast. Please take a moment to visit our website, practicalpreservationservices.com, for additional information and tips to help you restore your historical home. If you've not done so, please subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud, and also like us on Facebook. Welcome to the Practical Preservation Podcast, hosted by Danielle and Jonathan Kepperling. Kepperling Preservation Services is a family-owned business based in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, dedicated to the preservation of our built architectural history for today's use as well as future generations. Our weekly podcast provides you with expert advice specific to the unique needs of renovating a historic home, educating by sharing our From the Trenches preservation knowledge and our guests' expertise, balancing modern needs while maintaining the historical significance, character, and beauty of your period home.
Today on the Practical Preservation Podcast, I have with me Dr. Christopher Rogers from the Friends of the Tanner House. Thank you for joining me today.
Yes, thanks for having me. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah. So tell me about your background.
Um, yeah. Well, I guess we got the doctor in there. So this is just I got a PhD. My PhD is in education. The project was Black storytelling in West Philadelphia, which really covered a lot of the time that I spent as a volunteer and the volunteer program director at Paul Robeson House and Museum in West Philadelphia, which is probably my first real stint within whatever this thing preservation is called. I don't know. I don't really consider myself a preservationist. I'm kind of around, and I think deeply about history, of course, but it's not really my bag per se. I didn't go to school for it, but before that, I'm an educator, teacher. I focus a lot on Black studies, um, focus a lot on community, like lifelong learning, spaces of community organizing within neighborhoods, um, spaces for popular education, and obviously, history and historical sort of like sites have to do a lot with that sort of like pedagogy of teaching people about place, teaching people about inheritance, teaching people about struggle. So that kind of work brought me into this field and have been sort of like working, building up projects since about 2015, I guess you could say.
Okay, very good. Yeah, actually, you saying that you don't feel like you're like maybe a traditional preservationist. When I was prepping for the podcast and I was going through the website, I actually thought that a little bit, not specifically about you, but just about the project, because it was more about saving the story than the building. But there was a book that I read during the pandemic, and a professor from, I think he was from Swarthmore, maybe he was from Bryn Mawr, one of the colleges down that way. He was a political science professor, but he wrote a book about collective memory and how places are are those touchstones are what creates the collective memory that keeps it even after people die and move away and aren't telling the story anymore. Those places are still there. So I had that thought. So I'm glad that you said that, in your first answer, because that was a thought that I had, that it's probably not traditional preservation, but it's important to save those places so we can look to them and say, yes, these things did happen.
Yeah, I like that phrase you said, like saving the story is more important than saving the building.
Yeah.
Like I've had debates with some of our collaborators in terms of you know um that door, we got to get rid of that door. And I'm like, they go, uh, whoa. We haven't even done a historical, assessment of the
Mhm.
source of the door. I'm like, but it's a bad door. Like it gotta go. Like it's going to fall.
Right.
Um, But no, 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 no. I'm telling you, but Chris, you don't know. And I'm like, it's not about the door.
Right. Yeah.
For me, it's like, it's not about the door.
Yeah.
The entry space and the storytelling that is possible
Hmm.
within this three-dimensional home,
Right.
um, years of history that it represents
Hmm.
are like about the imagination, like you said, that's involved in the storytelling,
Hmm.
that's involved in the creative um process of how we deliver history.
Yeah.
And sometimes to just think that the door does the work
Yeah.
is not enough. It's like the materials, yes, I think there is a way to read them in very sort of like interesting and provocative ways, but that's not available to everybody, you
Right.
know? So like how do you talk about the other ways that we document histories and tell stories and preserve history and
Yeah.
preserve the possibilities of what that history represents
Right.
in
Exactly. And
ways that, yeah.
yeah, I thought about that too, just looking at the exterior of that house because it's a row house, very much the same way that the Carter Woodson house in DC is a row
Mhm.
house. And that was not the types of spaces that were being preserved because they weren't the big grand houses, built by the people who are writing the history. So,
Which is
those are
another
things.
thing,
Yeah.
which is another thing, right? Like it's another thing about like same thing. So Robeson House is at 50th and Walnut, right in smack dab in the middle of Walnut Hill neighborhood.
Yeah.
Right to the right of it is 52nd Street, the sort of like main black business
Hmm.
hub of West Philadelphia. The Tanner House is on Diamond Street, North Philadelphia. A huge thoroughfare, 3 blocks away, 4 blocks away from Fairmount Park and Amanda Recreation Center and the basketball courts, 4 blocks the other way from the Hank Gather Center where Dawn Staley grew up. Like, so like there is a relationship to the everyday workings of a community,
Right.
and so much of historic preservation, traditional historic preservation, is about exceptionalizing
Right.
these spaces,
Yeah.
isolating these spaces
Hmm. Yeah.
from the everyday life of a community.
Yeah. I,
And
I
that's not
think that's
something that
very
we're trying
true.
to like do. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Because and I think that's something that has changed within preservation very recently. But I think that the having people see themselves in the stories and in the history is so important because it helps to feel like you have a stake in the community and in the rest of the whole history of the country. I'm part-time executive director of the countywide advocacy group in Lancaster, and the we did, I guess it's now 2 years ago, or almost 2 years ago, we did untold stories in Lancaster County and there we had 5 different greenhouse sites, or yeah, greenhouse sites, but green book sites, but they all but one has been demolished because nobody even knew what they were. Those
Mhm.
kinds of things that we were highlighting, the stories that aren't told, but also the ways that we need to look at what we're preserving. That was kind of the purpose of that.
Yeah, I mean the challenge, well, a funny story would be the Tanner House,
Hmm.
2908 West Diamond Street, a national historic landmark
Yeah.
as, 1976, the Afro-American Bicentennial Corporation organized, got it, in partnership with Robert Thornton, who owned the property, got it listed
Hmm.
on the, Federal Register, the Henry Ossawa Tanner House. There's a blue marker, a Pennsylvania
Hmm.
blue marker that was installed in 1991 outside the property, which notes the sort of like history of Henry Ossawa Tanner. The folks on my block
Hmm.
or on the block of the Tanner house
Yeah.
know don't know it as, the Tanners, the blah blah blah, like
Uh-huh.
the magnificent history of the Tanner family.
Hmm.
It was a speakeasy.
Yeah.
Uncle Jojo, and his wife, like turned the Tanner House into what the community knows as the hot dog cart. That was open, that was
Yeah.
after hours, that
Yeah.
was open from 12 to 6 over the weekends. Mrs. Salim, who lives across the street, was the bartender there. Many people from the neighborhood talk about, good nights and some iffy nights that
Right.
happen, at the speakeasy. Um, that is also a history.
Right. It
That
is.
is also a history worth preserving
Hmm.
of how informal and sometimes illicit economies
Right.
that Black people chose or were sort of like coerced
Hmm.
into
Yeah.
were created to be able to live sustainable lives
Hmm.
in the wake of legacies of Black impoverishment led by this nation's commitment to white, supremacy. So
Yeah.
like there is a history there that is also relevant
Yeah.
and also useful
Hmm.
about how Black communities organize to create pleasure,
Hmm.
joy in the wake or in spite of so much that they are going through.
And they
So
weren't,
how do you,
yeah.
yeah,
I was just thinking, and they weren't waiting for somebody else to do it for them. And that was one of the things that I chose when I was choosing stories. They had to be, stories of resilience and the communities doing it for themselves. Because that's really, I mean, it's throughout our history, you see it, but I don't think that's always the story that's told. So I think
yeah,
that's a great angle. So we talked a little bit about what drew you into to at least this history, and that you're not really a preservationist, but I would argue that you probably are more so than you think. But tell me a little bit about the Tanner family.
yes. Um, so as I sort of mentioned before, the house itself finds its most visible historical sort of like nomination through the life of Henry Ossawa Tanner. Henry Ossawa Tanner, Smithsonian calls him the most accomplished African American artist of the 19th century. Um, he, was born in Pittsburgh to his parents, which I'll talk about in a minute, but spent his adolescent life here in Philadelphia. And really, that's where he made his first commitment to painting. He goes to the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. Um, and then eventually is able to sort of like he travels to Atlanta, then finds a benefactor who allows him to travel all throughout the sort of like Holy Land, Palestine. He does a trip throughout North Africa, and eventually ends up settling in Paris. Um, and during his time in Paris is really where his art takes off. He's one of the first Black artists to have his work purchased and featured in a major museum. The Annunciation by Henry Ossawa Tanner's The Annunciation was purchased by the Philadelphia Museum of Art. It is still on display to this day. Um, so like the Banjo Lesson, The Thankful Poor are two other works that can like continue to like have recirculating images. And there's a whole lot more, but someone who really set the mold for what Black visual artists could achieve.
Yeah.
Um, but that's just the son, his
Yes.
first
Yeah.
son.
Yeah.
And the father, and he's actually like responding to a call that his mother and father have really, got
Mhm.
started, right? So
Yeah.
his father is Bishop Benjamin Tucker Tanner, a bishop of the AME Church,
Hmm.
who spent a lot of time working at Mother Bethel AME, which has its own, historical marker, historical significance as being one of the longest owned plots of land by Africans
Hmm.
before they even knew themselves to be African Americans
Right.
um, within, on these lands. Um, his father was a newspaper man. He ran the Christian Recorder, which was the sort of like newspaper of the AME Church. He also helped sort of like start and build out the AME Review, which was like a journal publication that came out of the AME Church. And he wrote, numerous books. So one of the books was like challenging the idea of this biblical curse
Hmm.
that Black people um that Black people were cursed biblically, like the sort of like curse of Ham,
Right.
and like refuting that through a theological interpretation. His father's work has, or the bishop's work has always, you know, traverse the line between deep theological interpretation, but also applying those principles into the Black historical struggle.
Yeah.
He's written about in like the Emancipation Circuit, this amazing text by Talani Davis that looks at, post-Reconstruction
Hmm.
Black life throughout the South and seeing the types of networks and institutions that they built in order to carry this vision of freedom, right? And Bishop Benjamin Tucker Tanner was part of helping spread that sort of like gospel in that way.
Yeah.
Um, his mother, Sarah Elizabeth Miller Tanner, um, she grew up, the first year she was enslaved.
Hmm.
Um, as the story goes, or the rumors of a story, there's more history to always do.
Yeah.
But is her mother had 11 children. Half were to her enslaved sort of like lover and partner. Um, and then half were to the outcome of, the slave master and his, you know, don't want to get too far into that, but yes.
Yeah.
And that the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, or the mother became aware of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society having a wagon that was going to come through that area. But the wagon only had 6 seats.
Mm.
She had 11 children.
Yeah.
And Sarah was one of those children that her mother chose for her to go to a freedom that her mother would otherwise never, be
Mhm.
able to fully claim.
Mhm.
And she makes her way through Philadelphia. She ends up in Pittsburgh, becomes a very well educated woman, meets Bishop Benjamin Tucker Tanner in college, is known to run the finances for the family, runs the Sunday school at Mother Bethel AME. And yeah, just like that, leadership
Yeah.
that she's expressed as well.
Mhm.
Um, and there's more.
Yeah.
There's certainly more, I don't know if
That
you got
but
time
that
for more.
Yeah, and I think though that is those stories are so important to tell because it I think it really changes the narrative of enslavement, but also post Reconstruction and what those families were doing.
Right,
Yeah, and I won't get into what my mom's family was doing, but they were, my great grandfather was an AME minister also, and he spent time in the military, but then as soon as they got out, they didn't go back to Tennessee, they went west. And I think that was also a very normal reaction to not wanting to put their children back into the South. Uh,
right.
yeah, yeah. So,
There is a story. I got a story about that one too.
yeah.
If you get so, Henry's younger sister,
Hmm.
Tanner Dillon Johnson, who was an associate editor for the Christian Recorder alongside her father, marries pretty early. Her first husband dies tragically. She's still in her mid-20s. Like I said, very educated as well. Decides she's going to medical school. Enrolls at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. Graduates with honors. Family friend, someone who the bishop knows well, Booker T. Washington,
Hmm.
is looking to start a nursing school at Tuskegee in Alabama.
Yeah.
Um, Haley Tanner Dillon Johnson, who grew up a free Negro
Right.
woman in Philadelphia, chooses to join Booker T. Washington, 1890 Alabama,
Yeah.
to start the nursing school, and also starts a local dispensary that is dedicated to serving the Black community who otherwise didn't have sort of like health access.
Yeah.
And to think that, this free Black woman, 1890, makes this commitment
Yeah.
to build up important health institutions and a new generation of health professionals
Oh yeah.
throughout the
It was
South.
necessary. Yeah.
It's it's incredible, right?
Yeah. That is very incredible. So tell me about the Friends of the Tanner House.
So the Friends of the Tanner House is an organization, um, um, like 2021, late 2021, November, December 2021. Um, there's a new LNI violation sticker that is placed upon the property. Um, aware to the owner in some way. They didn't have the owner's direct number,
Okay.
but the owner was aware of the property that it needed support and it needed help.
Yeah.
But we're in the midst of a pandemic. You know, belts are tightening. The idea of like investing into a property that is also, you know, it's a national landmark. But that also has particular complications when it comes to like things you need to be aware of when you're investing into its restoration.
Right.
Or will they allow you to do it cheaply?
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah.
no. Um, so he's at a point where it's not in a space where he sees the possibility of like what it would take to save this house. And the house is in pretty terrible condition.
Mhm.
Um,
Was
and
it vacant?
it was vacant at the
Okay.
time.
Okay.
Someone was living there probably way too late into his
Mhm.
deterioration. And thankful to family who created the support for her
Yeah.
to move out. Um, but the house was, falling apart. The roof was wide open. Water is sort of like leaking through all the floors.
Mhm.
Um, Dr. Thornton, really thought to demolish the house as to not to create a liability on his neighbors.
Mhm.
Um, and, work with some engineers to kind of help prove the point that it needed to be demolished.
Yeah.
Then he turns that report into L&I. L&I says it's a historic commission. Historic commission goes, "Oh, no, 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 no. You can't demolish this. This is a national historic landmark. You got to do something else." Obviously, but they're not giving them any money to do it. They're just
Right.
saying,
Right.
"You can't do it." Right? And now he's stuck in some ways, right? Like, what am I supposed to do with this property? I don't have the resources to fix it. And at the same time, it's, uh yes, I understand the history that it represents,
Mhm.
but I need help. I need support.
Right.
Um, and I think that's where we first come into conversation with him around, the property and saying, we want like the friends want to support the stabilization of this property.
Okay.
And in the beginning, it was just that. It was just that. It was, what can we do to make sure that this property doesn't disappear?
Right.
But we did not see ourselves being the ones who would steward it long
Mhm.
term.
Yeah.
Um, in the midst of the organizing and the relationship building and making connections with Tanner family descendants,
Mhm.
um, and some key institutions, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, Philadelphia Museum of Art. We worked with the Center for Preservation of Civil Rights Sites at the University of Pennsylvania. We were on the 11 most endangered list from the National Historic Trust.
Yeah.
We received a grant from the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, project of the National Trust.
Mhm. Yeah.
Those relationships and supportive bases allowed us to see a possibility for the long-term stewardship and revitalization of this house
Yeah.
that in some ways could represent a new generation of Black, sort of like Black heritage preservation organizing
Yeah.
that was meant to be like in Black working class communities
Mhm.
and thinking about the possibilities of revitalizing alongside like a community engaged process
Yeah.
that shows the possibilities not just for the house but for the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think that that's really an important distinction because, yeah, when you're in a neighborhood, you have to get the buy-in from everybody. And it's helpful everywhere you are, but especially if you're, if you're in a row house, you have neighbors like that are touching you, and you need to
Right.
get that buy-in. I'm sure they were very happy to see it stabilized, but so how have you kind of worked to get the community involved and enthusiastic?
Many different ways, and we're still growing in that too.
Mhm.
So uh, we did get a Mellon Foundation funding in partnership with the Center for Preservation of Civil Rights Sites to create what we call like a community visioning process.
Okay.
which was our way of, we probably could have used or needed to use those funds directly on the construction of the house, but
Yeah.
it was an eligible expense.
Yeah.
So we thought about a process in which we could do events of all different kinds that were grounded in the legacies of the Tanner family, um, that was doing something materially useful for the neighborhood, bringing folks together to talk about what the legacies in this house represent, but also, why it was important for us to save it and what um, form, function, or feeling could it represent
Yeah.
for the neighborhood itself. So that led us into this question of, was it for love to thrive in our neighborhood?
Hmm.
And how can the sort of revitalization effort of the Tanner House reflect that love that the community has for itself?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so we did about maybe 10, 11 events
Hmm.
um, over about a year and a half, um, collaborating with a local artists. Another line of that is design and preservation series, where we're bringing um, folks who are doing, heritage site or heritage initiatives together to talk about like working in coalition and collaboration. The Friends of the Tanner House Community Network is built out of that, which is sites that are across the neighborhoods that represent Strawberry Mansion. These are like the zip codes of 19121 and 19132. So organizations that represent what we have defined as like Tanner family legacy pursuits, faith, family, freedom, arts, health, and education. Like who are the entities and the leaders that are advancing that work in the neighborhood today? And how can we both earn their trust, but also, recognize it as a two-way street? Like, what do we have to offer them
Yes.
too in their work?
Yeah.
Um, and that's where the community partner network is built out of. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's great. So you've stabilized the building. Is that what stage are you in with the preservation?
Right now, a wall is being erected at the
Okay.
Tanner House that will prayerfully finalize the L&I violation effort
Okay.
um, from 2021.
Okay.
They allowed us to do all the work to renew the roof at the Tanner House, to just allow us to get to the final inspection, to remind us that fixing the roof is only one part of the violation. And then the other part was this wall that
Yeah.
needed to be replaced. Um, which, when you spend a year just trying to get enough money to fix a roof,
Right.
and then you get the money to fix the roof, and then you have to walk, and then you have to change orders and everything that was needed
Hmm.
to be able to fix the roof, and you finally get through all that, and then at the end of it, they go, "Oh no, you're not done. You got to do a whole nother thing."
Oh, that
It is
doesn't.
such a deflating moment. It is
Yeah.
such a deflating moment.
Yeah. It
And
doesn't
it's
seem
like,
like
you
they were
do.
they were very willing to kind of give you all the information you needed to make the plans.
Which is another part of preservation work that I'm, starting to
Right.
get into, of just
Yeah.
the many different
Yeah.
stakeholders that are
Yes. Yeah.
involved that
Yeah.
need to be collaborated,
Yeah.
and information and transparent information
Hmm. Yeah.
around all these things. It's such a interesting effort.
Yeah. Yeah. Very, very true. So I have a couple more questions before we wrap up, but is there anything that you wanted to share that maybe you thought of while we were talking that I didn't think to ask you?
Um, Not too much. I mean, folks can follow us on SaveTheTannerHouse.org,
Okay.
Friends of the Tanner House, Friends of the Henry O. Tanner House on Facebook, um, Tanner House PHL on Twitter or X,
Okay.
and Tanner House Friends on Instagram.
Okay.
Uh, those are ways of, connecting. I encourage everybody to download our most recent report
Okay.
that reflects the community visioning process.
Mhm.
That's freely available. So just sign up for a download and get it. Um, yeah.
Okay. Are there other ways that our listeners could support, or do you have like donations on the website or anything like that?
Yes, you can definitely donate on the website. We're gearing up for our end of year sort of giving season right now. So working on some announcements and naming our sort of like next goal of, trying to raise $15,000 throughout this fall season to recoup on some of the rising construction costs.
Yeah.
Um, at the Tanner House. And we're doing that alongside announcing our new expanded board of directors. So we're really just starting to find the foundation for the long haul effort that this represents, um, and building a institutional culture as we figure out the plan for what the revitalization of this house will be.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed learning about the organization and about the Tanner family. So I appreciate that.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the invitation,
You're
and
welcome.
definitely be back in conversation soon.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Practical Preservation Podcast. The resources discussed during this episode are on our website at practicalpreservationservices.com/podcast. If you received value from this episode and know someone else that will get value from it as well, please share it with them. Join us next week for another episode of the Practical Preservation Podcast. For more information on restoring your historic home, visit practicalpreservationservices.com.